Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Charlotte Museum of History's Lunch and Learn program. We are so delighted that so many people were interested in joining us. We are trying our hand at Facebook Live for this particular event today, so that way we could have as many people as wanted to join us here. So thank you for being here. Thank you for being a part of our museum at home. I am so excited by the conversation we're going to be having today, and I'm excited to introduce our guest speaker today from historic Stagville State Historic Site in just a moment. But I wanted to tell you first just a little bit about this program today. The goal is to have a space for dialogue and conversation about the history of slavery and Reconstruction, what we as historians do to make sure that we are creating a complete and authentic picture of our past in North Carolina, as well as to celebrate the accomplishments, resistance, and persistence of the people that Juneteenth remembers. We want to hear from you today, and we encourage you to comment in our chat on the Facebook Live post. We want your comments, we want your questions during today's program. We simply ask that you stay on topic and be respectful of others. And so without further ado, I'm so excited to introduce our speaker here. Khadija McNair is the Assistant Site Manager at Historic Stagville State Historic Site. She is a Durham, North Carolina native and obtained her bachelor's and master's degree in history from the North Carolina Central University. Before she came to Stagville, Khadija was an interpreter at Duke Homestead State Historic Site and also interpreted for a short time at Charlotte Hawkins Brown State Historic Site. Khadija has held various internships and worked on multiple projects, including the Orange County, North Carolina Slave Deed Database and the Tobacco and African American History Panel Series at Duke Homestead State Historic Site. Her research interests include various topics in public history and Black history in her hometown of Durham. So thank you so much for joining us, Khadija. We're so excited to have you here today.
Thank you for having me.
Well, I think to start out with, I really want to hear a little bit more about Stagville State Historic Site. So what is the history of your site? What do you interpret?
Yeah, so Stagville was once the site of one of the largest plantations in North Carolina. So we know that at its height, there were over 30,000 acres of land and a little over 900 people enslaved there at one time. The state today owns about 160 acres of land, and so we have about 6 historic buildings, and we have the original home of the slaveholders there. We have 4 original slave dwellings and a large barn that was built through enslaved labor. So we focus all of our interpretation on the history of enslaved people between the Cameron plantation. So the Stagville was owned by one family. The name changes through marriage, but we call it the Benahan Cameron family plantation. And so that's really what we center our interpretation on, just the lives and experiences of enslaved people on that property.
Excellent. Now you use the word enslaved, which I think is such an important thing to say when we're talking about the people whose lives you're interpreting. So why enslaved? Why that word?
Yeah, so we use the word enslaved rather than slave because we're recognizing the humanity in people who were forced to labor, people who were in bondage. So we know that by using that adjective instead of using the noun slave, we highlight the forced condition of slavery and the actions of those who enforced that condition.
Mm-hmm. Now, I know that's right on the very front page of any of the literature that you get when you visit the site, and actually personally, it's on my bulletin board in my office to remind me time that I'm talking about the people who lived on our site, the 13 enslaved people who didn't choose to be there.
Right.
That reminds me of who they are. So I think that's such a powerful and important part about telling this story. So you said that there were over 900 people enslaved at Historic Stagville. Tell me a little bit about some of them. Tell me some of their stories that you do know.
Yeah, so myself and our site manager, Vera Staselski, we are doing a lot of research. It's definitely ongoing to uncover some of those personal stories. So we have a number of stories. I can call out a few. So one person we talk about in our normal tours is Mary Walker. So she was a woman who was enslaved at Stagville, and she was enslaved, doing domestic and slave labor for the Cameron family. And she is one of few people we know to have taken their freedom from Stagville. So we talk all about what that experience would have been like for her. Let's talk about a man named Virgil Benahan. He was the only person to have been given their freedom from Stagville. We talk about There's a woman named Rosetta. She's an enslaved seamstress we know about, and she resists slavery through slowing down her work. She sews things very slowly. And we have many stories like that. And most of those stories we get from the Cameron family papers. So what the slaveholders were saying about the enslaved people. And so we literally are going off, one line or two lines in this letter that Paul Cameron wrote. And we're, kind of thinking up all the different aspects of that story off these, two sentences. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. Tell me a little bit more about the research process associated with this, because I know Stagville has been actively looking for information and actively providing resources for people that are looking into this history. So tell me a little bit about what that looks like.
Yeah, so all the Cameron family papers are at UNC in the Wilson Library there. So we do a lot of digging through those papers, and we have a lot of volunteers to help us do that work. So it's definitely not just me and the site manager. And so we're seeing, the actual papers of the slaveholders. We look a lot at census records, to kind of see that ongoing history. So a large part of the work that we do is also keeping a very large genealogy database. So at Stagville, we keep track of descendants of enslaved people in Stagville and kind of where those families are today. We have a lot of descendants that still reside in Durham. We have some people that are all over the world, and they'll email or call us, and we do that research for people for free. We also keep a large photo archive, so we hold on to family photos for descendants, and we have ongoing oral history archive as well of descendants. So we just kind of dig through all those resources and kind of put those stories together that way as well.
Excellent. I think it's important to have all sorts of different resources available, and it's so great to hear that you guys are offering that service for free, because I know that's what we hear with a lot of our partners when it comes to genealogy. Is it's tough. It's tough on a good day, and the records are so far and so few and in between. And especially when it comes to doing research about enslaved people, there are so many barriers to people being able to tell their stories during that time. I know you mentioned you have to use the Cameron. Can you, for people who don't know, can you explain why you have to use the Cameron papers, why you can't look at papers written by enslaved people on the site?
Yeah, so we know that it was illegal for enslaved people to know how to read and write, and we don't have many records from people who were enslaved at Stagville from their own hand. So, we have, we know a little bit about Mary Walker, for example, but she takes her freedom and she, records her life after she is freed. But we're looking at the Cameron family papers because that's kind of one of the only resources we have to learn about enslaved people. Something that's pretty odd about the Camerons is that they keep very detailed records at certain points in time. So they're keeping birth records at one point for enslaved people. So we can see families there. They're kind of keeping like a census of Stagville. They're going through and recording mother, father, children living in different parts of the plantation. And so those are really weird kind of for slaveholders. We know that most plantations did not have such detailed accounts from slaveholders. And so those give us a really good view into that as well. So some families who are tracing their genealogy through Stagville, they can really get pretty far back through those records. We have some people who can trace their ancestry to the 1790s, people being enslaved at Stagville.
I think that's such a powerful thing to feel that connection to a story there. I know one of the things for me when visiting sites that I know that there were enslaved populations there is seeing the fingerprints of those people on that site itself. I know I've seen actual fingerprints in the bricks, but I've also seen it in the types of stories that we're able to tell through foodways, through cultural traditions. I think it has actual fingerprints as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, so we have 4 bricks in one chimney that have fingerprints in them, and one even has a toe print, it's kind of about that big. A small enslaved child stepped into a brick. And so we definitely see those as people leaving their mark, people saying, this is mine. I built this building, I built this chimney. And we also can we can use those to talk about labor. So what would that have looked like? That small child who left that toe print was likely working in the bricks at Stagville. So yeah, we can look at them many different ways.
And it's those voices and being able to kind of tell those stories that I think makes Stagville such a powerful spot to be, and such a powerful place to kind of have these conversations and be able to talk and kind of hold that mirror up to history as it really is. Because I know as museum professionals, that's really what we want to tell what happened, and we want to tell you an accurate story, and with as much research and information as we can.
Definitely. And of course, with working with the history of slavery, we have those records from the Camerons, and they're talking about people in a certain way. For example, there's a letter that Paul Cameron writes about a woman named Faithy, and he's describing her as being just a really filthy person. Her slave dwelling is, he calls it, really disgusting and gross the way he's describing it. And we know that he moves her children out of her home because he doesn't want them to be sick, to kind of, contain that labor force. He doesn't want people to get sick so they can continue to work. And the way he's describing her, if we took it at face value, we would think, oh, she's just a really gross person. But we know that we're reading something very biased, right? We're reading from the view of the enslaver. And so when looking at Faithy's, or those couple lines about Faithy in that letter, we know that she's enslaved. She's working 12-hour days, or likely longer days. So how much time does she have to devote to keeping her space clean? We know that enslaved people are living in the least clean parts of the plantation, places that are prone to flooding, prone to mosquitoes and disease. So all these factors working against her, and of course it would benefit, or of course Paul Cameron would look at that a certain way as the person who's enslaving her and her family.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. The stories that we're seeing are written with a very specific idea in mind, and it may not be the most accurate picture of who that person was.
Right, exactly.
Well, I'm so glad to hear all of the work that you guys are doing to really elevate these voices and to talk about the resistance, the persistence, and the humanity of people who didn't necessarily have a choice in what their lives were going to look like, but the things that they did to kind of seize control, be that gaining freedom or just simply kind of being, holding on to that humanity, which I think is such an important part of the story.
Thank you.
And especially as we move towards Juneteenth, which is such a big celebration and such an important part of kind of regaining that sense of humanity, which have been denied to these people for so long. So I know a lot of people have been asking us, what exactly is Juneteenth? So can you tell us a little bit about kind of generally about this holiday?
Yeah, so Juneteenth literally relates to June 19th. So that's the date in 1865 where people in Galveston, Texas, enslaved people found out that they were emancipated. So we know that Texas was pretty remote and untouched during the Civil War. There was not a lot of fighting there. And so we know that most people find out about freedom around April of 1865 after the large Confederate surrender. And it doesn't really reach Texas for 2 months until about June, a couple months later. And so we know Major General Gordon Granger, a Union general, he goes into Texas and informs people on June 19th, 1865. And so it's commemorated in Texas as Emancipation Day or Jubilee Day. It wasn't really called Juneteenth early on. But yeah, so that's kind of where it initially springs from.
Excellent. So people had been free since about 1863 after the Emancipation Proclamation, I believe January 1st, is that correct? Of 1863? Right. And just took a while to spread to Texas because of the distance, and also because I'm assuming there was some resistance as well to the Emancipation Proclamation.
Definitely. So we know that slaveholders are resisting, releasing enslaved people. They don't want to get rid of that free labor force. Some of the sources I read even said that, slaveholders from other states were moving into Texas because they knew that people weren't freeing their slaves right away there.
Mhm. So get to June 19th, 1865, and it's the last group of enslaved people that are told that they are finally free. Do we know a little bit about what that looked like when people were hearing about freedom?
Yeah, so we have a couple stories from Stagville. So we know it's a really mixed reaction. So we have a account from a man named Morgan Latta. He was on the Cameron's plantation in an area called Fish Dam, and he talked about people, rejoicing immediately. They start fasting and praising God for their freedom. But we also know that around March of 1865 at Stagville, federal troops and Confederate troops start to move into that area. So they're in search of food, shelter, and supplies. And we understand that time as a time of fear and uncertainty for freed people. So we have a record, or there's a WPA narrative, an interview that was done with a woman named Sarah Devereaux. She was enslaved on the plantation pretty close to Stagville. And she talked about Confederate troops coming to the property where she was and threatening enslaved people. She said they asked enslaved men if they wanted to be free. And if they said yes, they shot them. And if they said no, they let them alone. And so she says that she lost 3 of her uncles that day. We also know about a man named Abner Jordan, who was enslaved at Stagville, and he says that federal troops, Union troops, came and asked his mom where the Cameron's silver and gold was, and they threatened her life. And so somehow she's able to get away from them. She doesn't know where the silver and gold is. And another man named Cy Hart talks about Union troops coming on to Stagville and ordering his mother to cook and serve them. And so while this was also seen as a time of, rejoicing, people are also being threatened. They're very fearful and as troops are moving in. We also see people who are immediately aiming to reconnect with family. So we know a story about a man named Elijah and his partner Lucy. They were actually sold away from the Cameron's plantations about 6 years before the end of the Civil War. And Paul Cameron gets news that they are making their way back to Stagville. They're coming from Edgecombe County. They were walking about 85 miles to come back without money or any type of supplies. And we believe they're likely looking for a family or community they were forcibly separated from. We also see people immediately demanding property and some type of restitution, rights to the land that they had, labored on for generations. So we have a letter that Paul Cameron writes. He's in shock that people wanted a freehold interest in the soil on which they reside. We know about a freedman named Jesse. He was enslaved as a coachman for the Camerons, and he begins to organize people to fight for the land that they had lived on for their whole lives. And we also see people resisting the control of overseers. So we know that there would be white men who were employed by the Camerons to watch over the enslaved population. A man named Samuel Piper, who was an overseer at Stagville, reported that freed people would look him in the eye and slow down anytime he ordered them to work faster. Paul Cameron also says that freed people threatened the lives of overseers and drove them off the land if they tried to control the workers. So people are immediately resisting. One of the most notable stories we have about resistance is a general strike that happens at Stagville in the middle of the fall of 1865 during the wheat harvest. We know enslaved people got together and refused to take their pay and shares of wheat. And they refused to continue to work until Paul Cameron negotiated fair wages for them. We know that at that point, Paul Cameron calls in federal troops, and the troops force people to return to work and actually cut their wages even more than they were before. We also know that around that time, around late 1865, the Camerons started to evict people off of their property, people that they saw as troublemakers or insolent. And when we think of what troublemakers meant to the Camerons, it could mean anything from people who were organizing resistance or those who just spoke negatively about them, people who were no longer being, good enslaved people who who were exercising their freedom, right? So we know of a woman named Emma who was formerly an enslaved cook for them. She stays on their property and continues to work in domestic spaces for wages. And Paul Cameron writes about her, and he says that she was being impudent and that his sister Maggie evicts her. And when Maggie evicts Emma, Emma tells her, "My hair is as straight as yours, my skin is as white as yours, and now I'm as free as you." And so Emma is literally throwing back, the legacy of sexual assault and rape of the Camerons. She's saying, my mother or my grandmother was abused by these men, and now I'm free as you. I have some of that power now. I have all of that power now. So we see that emancipation takes a lot of different forms. We know that it's not very passive. People aren't just sitting around waiting to figure out what's next. It's a time of resistance. It's a time of varying emotions.
Absolutely. Juneteenth is this incredible celebration, but it's one day and it's one moment. And then there's all of this that comes afterwards, all of these emotions, all of these feelings. And I think you brought up something really important, this idea of fear as well. We think of, all right, everyone's free now, this is great. And then there's this question of, well, what does that mean for me? I know I've heard stories of incredible fear from people who, after emancipation, go, well, what do I do? Do you have stories from Stagville of people kind of running back to the quarters or trying to grab things and trying to set up a space for them? I know you mentioned that some people were trying to organize resistance and gain control. So you have, I believe, 6 enslaved cabins. Is that correct?
We have 4.
4, sorry.
No, you're fine. But yeah, so we don't have any specific stories that stick out about that, but we know that generally people are experiencing that fear. They what does freedom look like? What does that even mean? And so we do see sharecropping come into play. People do immediately resist those sharecropping contracts because they're, very unfair. They're ordered to give the Camerons 3/4 of their harvest every season. But by the end of 1865, we know that there's a large amount of people who sign those contracts. Paul Cameron says that there are about 700 to 800 people still living on Stagville property. So more or about the same amount of people who are there who were enslaved or who were enslaved there, earlier that year.
Mm-hmm. So we're definitely seeing kind of a lot of different stories and a lot of different approaches. And then, of course, as I said, Juneteenth is one day, and then things continue. Some things improve, but some things don't. So we're seeing that there's a lot of work that's going to happen afterwards.
Definitely, yeah. And we know that people are still subject to violence and abuse. We know that Black codes and Jim Crow come not too soon after. So the rights of African Americans are still restricted. And in many ways, slaveholders or former slaveholders are looking to reinforce slavery to gain that free labor source again. And so we definitely see that through sharecropping.
Mm-hmm. Now, we've talked a little bit about kind of what happens after Juneteenth, a lot of the emancipation in North Carolina. We see similar things happening in Charlotte as are happening at Stagville. Plantation sites in Charlotte tend to be a little bit smaller. Here in the western part of the state, by no means any less terrible in many ways, just a little bit smaller. But we've noticed that recently Juneteenth has been sort of coming more to the forefront. I know it's something that we're seeing a lot more. People are talking about what this means. So why do you think Juneteenth has become such an important touchstone recently? What about it?
I did a little bit of research, and I read an article that talked about kind of how Juneteenth has progressed over time. And it looks like after or between 1910 and 1930, Juneteenth celebrations kind of go on the decline. And really around the 40s and 50s and 60s, it starts to resurge. And definitely with the onset of the civil rights movement. So people are, looking at, the current struggles of the civil rights movement and relating that to the struggles of their ancestors, right? The people who were enslaved. And so I think that might have a lot to do with it now. What are the legacies of slavery, and how can we honor and commemorate our ancestors who were enslaved, and what hasn't changed and what has changed. So, yeah.
Mhm. And I think for me, one reason that I find Juneteenth such a good celebration for me personally to kind of think about what this means is I love that it is a celebration, and I love that it's a celebration of the people. It's the people who were enslaved, and it's the things that they did to regain their humanity, not just at Juneteenth, but afterwards and before, and all of these kind of stories, and that feeling of realizing that people have what we in the historical field call agency. They have control even in the darkest of circumstances. So I think Juneteenth can be such a wonderful thing for us to really celebrate. And I know Stagville does celebrate Juneteenth normally. Can you tell us a little bit about your celebration?
Yeah, so we normally have a large Juneteenth event, and we have performers, and of course we open up our historic buildings, the original slave dwellings, and we talk about the history, and we have vendors and food and all different types of things going on. It's a lot of fun, but we definitely see that see Juneteenth as a time to talk about emancipation in all its forms. We often think of it as a moment, a very positive thing, which it definitely is, but we want to kind of give it, look at it from all angles. What were people experiencing? What happens after? We have, all 4 of the slave buildings that we have on the site were built around 1850, but we know that after slavery ends, people who were formerly enslaved or descendants of enslaved people stay in those buildings as sharecroppers. And so we have one building that was kind of renovated. It was painted, there was a porch added on, and we know the Hart family lived in that building. So we definitely use that one to talk about the legacy of slavery. The Great Depression, what were people doing at Stagville during that time? So we use Juneteenth to just kind of continue that history. We normally focus all about this, on the stories of enslaved people. So Juneteenth is a great time for us to kind of get a little bit past that history as well.
Absolutely. Now, before we kind of open it up to some more questions from our audience, I have a question for you as a museum professional. So when we originally conceived of this program, and you and I were talking at the beginning of May, I don't think either of us could have predicted just how many people would be tuned in, what the world was going to look like here on June 18th of 2020. And so I'm going to put you on the spot for a second. Tell me, what role do museums play in telling this story? Why is it so important for us as cultural institutions to celebrate this holiday?
Yeah, I think it's extremely important because we, hold that history, especially sites of slavery. We are kind of we are the collectors of those stories. We are the collectors of that history, and it's important to celebrate Juneteenth to look at it from every angle. So, like, we can't talk about the history of enslavement without telling that story. From the traumas and the violence to the celebrations and the community and the hope that was fostered in those communities, or in the enslaved communities. So it's really important to celebrate Juneteenth at museums and historic sites because we can give, as a public history institution, we can give a broader narrative around what that looked like, around what emancipation and enslavement looked like.
Absolutely. I think that's at the Charlotte Museum of History, our mission is that we tell the stories of the people of Charlotte, and that means everyone's story. Everyone should be able to walk through the doors of our building, walk through our historic site, and know that we are telling everyone's story, and that everyone gets to be a part of the history. You should see yourself in this world, and I think that's why museums are so incredibly important. That's that space of dialogue. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, definitely. We totally agree.
Well, I've got a couple of questions from the audience that I'm going to start asking you, and Angel, feel free to join us if you want to tell us, read us some of these live, but I have a question about how does Stagville reach out to schools and local youth to educate the next generation about the history of slavery?
Yes, so we normally, before 2020, we have school groups come all the time. So from all over. We have multiple school programs that all of them focus on the stories of enslaved people, and we, invite schools to come. And we normally have 3 or 4 different schools to come in a week, especially in the fall. We also have homeschool days, so we invite homeschool families to come, and believe we do those twice or 3 times a year. And we set up different stations. All the stations are, hands-on activities that children can come and learn about the history of enslavement on our site. So those are the main things we do. We're always open to talking to students in any capacity. We definitely do outreach. We go to schools sometimes when they invite us. So yeah.
Absolutely, and I know you guys are a state historic site, and I know the state has an incredible commission that's put together to really kind of share resources. We've had a lot of fun with a lot of our partners at state organizations in a lot of our programs, just because there's such a wealth of resources and knowledge. And I'm so glad to hear you guys are going out and doing these kind of programs.
Yeah, it's so great. We also have a program where we partner with other historic sites, or the 2 other historic sites in Durham. So there's Bennett Place and Duke Homestead in Durham, and we have one school program where students can come through each site in one day and learn about the history of African Americans from enslavement to after the Civil War. And so we love that program. That's one of my favorites.
There's something about working with students and working with kids. They ask you the strangest questions you've ever gotten in your entire life, but they make you think in ways and make you kind of look at the sources, and it gives you the opportunity to really feel like you've made a difference in making people think about what our ideals are and what's still to come, because they've got such energy and passion.
Definitely. It's so cool to see their little brains work. They ask the most amazing questions, and the ones you don't get from adults, but you can just see what the wheels are turning. I love those moments.
Yeah, there's something to be said about that. I do have another question for you. I would love to hear a little bit more about the slave cabin. We have someone who's really curious to hear about the one particularly in the picture. And it's a gorgeous, absolutely stunning picture, and so I'd love to hear about that space.
Yeah, so that's one of the 4, and they all look pretty much the same. There's the one I talked about that's a little bit renovated, but they were built between 1850 and 1851, all through enslaved labor. They are 4-room, 2-story buildings. So there are 2 rooms downstairs, 2 rooms upstairs, and we know that there would have been one group of people in each room, and that was at least 8 to 10 people, so about 40 people per building possibly. And so there are fireplaces in every room. The rooms are, I'm not even really sure how to describe the size of them, but definitely not enough space for 10 people. So yeah, and in the one in the picture is actually the one that has the fingerprints in the bricks of it as well.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's so powerful about walking in these places where enslaved people lived is seeing just the size of it. We're so used to big open floor plans and space, and realizing that 10 people lived in space.
Yeah, and we know that those buildings aren't they're very unique. Most plantations didn't have these, apartment style 4-room buildings. And we know that there probably weren't many of those on Stagville's plantation. Those are just the 4 that have survived. Most people who were enslaved at Stagville were still living in those small 1-room cabins with dirt floors and mud and stick chimneys. So those people, sometimes people do come to our site and say, well, these are very big, or these are really nice. And we have to remind them, this is still a very cramped space. People are still, working from sun up to sundown. Of course, there's no glass in the windows. There's not a lot of ventilation in that space. So,
definitely a different world, to say the least. But it's such a powerful thing to really see. I have a couple of questions specifically about Juneteenth at Stagville and kind of emancipation at Stagville now for you. To shift gears just a little bit here, you mentioned self-emancipation. Can you tell us a little bit more about that particular story?
Yes. So Mary Walker, she was born enslaved at Stagville. We know that there, at the time she's born, Rebecca and Duncan Cameron are on that plantation. They own most of the plantation land, and they have 4 daughters. And Mary Walker is given to them when she's about 9 years old. She's pretty much the same age as they were. And the daughters began to pass away from tuberculosis. So they're kind of dying one after the other. And so we know that by the time Mary Walker is in her mid-20s, she's with one of the other daughters named Mildred Cameron. Mildred was also pretty sick, and by that time, they're both in their mid-20s. Mary Walker has 3 children who were enslaved at Stagville. And Mildred decides that she's going to travel back and forth to Philadelphia. And so we know that she's taking Mary Walker with her on those journeys. Mary Walker's there about 2 times before she takes her freedom. We believe that she does not, try to emancipate herself the first time or the second time because of her children. She left her children behind in North Carolina. And we know that on their 3rd trip, Mary Walker is in some type of confrontation or argument with Duncan Cameron, the slaveholder. And we don't know exactly what is said, but we believe that Duncan Cameron may have threatened to sell her or her children deeper into the South to Alabama. And so maybe she's thinking at that time, I'm not going to see my family whether I'm sold or if I'm free, so I might as well be free. And we know she takes her freedom by hiding in Philadelphia. She had been there multiple times. She met free Black people there who helped her to hide, and that is how she escaped slavery. But she did leave behind her 3 children, so we know that she tries to get someone to come to North Carolina and kind of kidnap her children. That does not work out. She actually has someone write letters to the Camerons on her behalf, asking to buy her kids out of slavery. The Camerons ignore those letters. And then around the time of the Civil War, around the end of the Civil War, there's a Union soldier who knows Mary Walker's story. And he's in Raleigh, and he actually finds 2 of her kids, and they are reunited with their mother. But that was 17 years after she left. And so when we talk about Mary Walker, we often kind of, talk about self-emancipation and how that's definitely a positive thing. That's a great thing. But we also try to focus on the emotions of Mary Walker. What did she feel after she left Stagville, after she took her freedom? She probably was, very fearful, maybe paranoid. She missed her children a lot. So while we think about freedom seeking is a very positive thing, we also want to recognize that people weren't, it wasn't all roses and peaches after they self-emancipated.
Absolutely, that's a powerful story. I truly and honestly don't have words for it. That's a very powerful story. We've spent a lot of time today talking about the people that this day is honoring. And so if people want to celebrate Juneteenth today and kind of want to look at those sort of celebrations, can you tell us a little bit about the origins of some of the kind of traditions of Juneteenth, the types of things that people do to celebrate, as well as kind of what kinds of things people could do today?
So historically, from my research, it kind of seemed like Juneteenth were pretty, the way we would think about, celebrations on, July 4th. So people are having parties, they're playing sports, they're doing fireworks, food, parades are happening during Juneteenth. I also saw a couple of things that said that Juneteenth was also a time to encourage African Americans to be involved in politics, to vote, right? So I was doing a little bit of research in the newspapers in North Carolina, and I found a little blurb in the News and Observer. It was really just one line. So this white newspaper, I believe it was from the early 1900s, and it said, Juneteenth is not a time to encourage the removal of the grandfather clause. So that was really powerful to me. Like, whites in North Carolina realize that this day is happening and realize people are talking about, removing, these, discriminatory voting laws, right? So yeah, I think that Juneteenth was kind of just, a big party. And the way you can celebrate now, definitely going to events. If next year Stagville will have our Juneteenth event. At Stagville particularly, we are doing most or pretty much all of our Juneteenth celebration on social media. So we're posting freedom story videos. So we're talking about the stories of people who we know were emancipated at Stagville and kind of what that looked like forward for them. We also are doing a Juneteenth timeline that'll be posted later this week. And we are giving guided tours of our grounds this weekend that will focus on stories of emancipation at Stagville. We know that people are staying at home also, so the way that we think people can kind of celebrate at home is definitely to support Black businesses, reach out to, Black organizations in your area, and also to kind of research enslavement in your city or county. So find those stories of emancipation where you are and just kind of learn more about what that looked like in your area.
Absolutely. I know what I've seen when it comes to kind of traditions and things that are changing over time. It starts out as very much a little bit of a religious holiday, kind of having prayers and having hymns sung, traditional spirituals. I've seen a lot. I know Library of Congress has a lot of these spirituals that are archived on their website. It's really cool. You can hear recordings from the early 20th century. I know, and I'll be perfectly honest, I don't know a lot about exactly where this tradition comes from, but I know there's a lot of eating of red foods, and there's drinking of strawberry punch. From what I was seeing, it looks like it's about red is this kind of color of resistance, and it's about understanding that you have power, you have agency, and you have the ability to make changes in your world. Can you tell me a little bit? I'm sorry, I'm gonna put you on the spot. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, I did see that also. Something that I read said that they use red to kind of signify the blood of African Americans and how there's, this, America was built on the blood of enslaved people, and how their blood is shed across the Americas. And so, yeah, that's the only thing I found really relating to that, which I think is really, really cool.
I think also part of what's so powerful about Juneteenth is that each area really kind of makes it their own. Each state, each community. I know here in Charlotte, we've been celebrating Juneteenth for over 20 years at this point. There is an amazing celebration that's held every year with drumming, traditional African kind of clothing, music, art, all sorts of different things, celebrating that African connection as well as the African American story here in Charlotte. They are hosting that this year. I know it's going to be over in Plaza Midwood for anyone who wants to check it out. It's going to be a socially distant celebration. Masks are required, but one of our partners over at House of Africa has been responsible for that for over 24 years now. So highly recommend checking that out. So Charlotte has this really rich tradition. I know that Durham has a really rich tradition as well. Obviously, you guys are put on a celebration usually, but I've also seen a lot of different things that communities are doing there. So it's definitely exciting to see that people are making this celebration their own. And I know the museum is going to be posting some resources as well. The Charlotte Museum of History will be posting some resources to tell you a little bit about what people are doing. I know our friends at the Levine are also going to be having a virtual celebration, Levine Museum of the New South, and our friends at the Harvey B. Gantt Center as well. So we'll, of course, share what's happening at Stagville. Mm-hmm. I think, unless we have any more questions from our audience, I think I'd love to turn it over to you, Khadija, to have that kind of last word about what exactly Juneteenth means to Stagville, means to you, or basically leave us with something brilliant,
So, I mean, Juneteenth is really just a time of celebration. I mean, it really is a time for me personally to just kind of think back on the experiences of people who were enslaved, people who were emancipated. I think it's definitely a time to honor their struggle, honor their fight, right? If there was no them, there would be no us. So I see Juneteenth as a day to just celebrate and remember the fight of people who were enslaved in North Carolina and throughout the nation.
Excellent. Well, I can't thank you enough for joining us today to share stories of what's happening at Stagville, share some of your research. to sort of explore all of this. We have been having so much fun with our lunch and learns in our museum from home here at the Charlotte Museum of History. It gives us the opportunity to connect with our friends across the state. We are offering all of these programs free of charge to our community as a support during extraordinary circumstances. We also have some amazing donors who have made that possible. Particularly, we really want to thank the Weatherspoon Family Foundation. They've done a matching grant for us, so now we have the opportunity to have any donations go twice as far. If anyone's interested in helping us continue to offer these programs for free, we would love for you to visit charlottemuseum.org/donate, as well as you can become a member of the Charlotte Museum of History to get access to our programs and to learn more and kind of support us here. And I see my colleague Angel is joining us here. So thank you all so much for joining us today. We are so excited that you're a part of this. Khadija, thank you again so much for talking today. Well, I hope everyone is staying safe and healthy, and I hope everyone has a fantastic Juneteenth celebration tomorrow.